A peeling notice was zip-tied to the chain-link fence. K9 unit decommissioned, restricted access. No ceremony, no farewell, just a faded label and a row of rusted cages tucked behind the county sheriff's yard, where decorated police dogs went to be forgotten. Most people in town never knew it existed. Fewer still cared. Behind those bars sat Runner, 120 pounds of muscle and graying fur, pressing his muzzle against cold iron, still waiting the way his handlers had once trained him to. But no one was coming. Until a 7-year-old girl in a pink jacket pushed her tiny hand through those rusted bars. And the toughest dog in the county began to cry. What she said next stopped a grown deputy sheriff dead in his tracks. Stay with us because this story will shake you to your core. Before we begin, our team is on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers this month so we can keep bringing you stories of courage and justice every single day. Hit that subscribe button right now and join our growing family. And tell me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you believe animals can feel betrayal? Drop your number in the comments below. We read every single one. The morning light came in thin and grey over the county sheriff's yard, pressing long shadows across cracked concrete and a rust-eaten fence line that most of the town had quietly learned to look past. It was not a place meant to be found. No public sign pointed toward it. No announcement acknowledged it. Just a forgotten stretch of ground behind the main facility, and behind that, a row of metal cages the department had stopped talking about years ago. Inside them sat the dogs. German shepherds, every one of them. Broad-chested animals with coats that had begun to silver at the jaw and ears, whose eyes carried a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. It is the tiredness of waiting, of watching every gate, every footstep, every uniform that passes, and believing every single time that this might be the one. Their handlers were never coming back. But nobody had told them that. A few still pressed their noses to the bars when boots scraped across the gravel, still lifted their heads toward the sound of a radio crackle or the jingle of a key chain, not out of fear, but out of a loyalty so deep it had outlasted the humans who'd built it. One dog sat apart from the others. Larger, older, a name still stenciled in fading black ink across the cage door, Runner, as though whoever wrote it had fully intended to come back and simply never did. He didn't pace, he didn't bark. He sat with his great grey head resting low on his paws, shoulders caved inward, the posture of an animal that has learned there is nothing left to brace for. A single tear caught the thin morning light as it traced a slow line through the fur beneath his eye. Across the yard, through the gap in a side fence she absolutely should not have squeezed through, a 7-year-old girl in a pink jacket stood completely still. And she was staring straight at him. Her rescue dog, Darwin, had led her here, past the no trespassing sign, past the rusted utility gate, past every adult instinct that should have turned her around. Darwin had been pulling at his leash since dawn, urgent and low-headed, the way he only moved when something was deeply wrong. Now he sat behind her quiet, his job was done. Amber took one step forward. Then another. She reached the cage, wrapped her small fingers around the bars, and looked into Runner's eyes, deep brown, full of a grief that no dog should have to carry alone. Behind her, heavy footsteps crossed the gravel. A shadow stretched long across the ground. "You're not supposed to be back here," a voice said, cold, clipped, final. Amber didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Runner, and very quietly she said something that would change everything. What did a 7-year-old girl say to a deputy sheriff that left him with nowhere left to stand? That answer is coming, and it will not let you go. It started 3 days before anyone would listen. Darwin had always been a calm dog. That was the first thing Amber's mother, Nora, told people when they asked about him. Calm, steady, the kind of animal that seemed to understand the weight of a room before any human in it did. He had come to them through a rescue organization 2 years prior, a young Labrador mix with a crooked ear and a scar along his left shoulder that nobody at the shelter could fully explain. He had chosen Amber the moment she walked through the door. Sat directly in front of her, looked up, and waited as though he had been expecting her specifically and had simply been patient about her arrival. He was not calm now. It began on a Tuesday morning, subtle enough that Nora almost dismissed it. Darwin refused his food. He stood at the back door of the house with his nose pressed flat against the glass, his breath fogging the pain in short, tight bursts. He whined once, not the lazy whine of a dog wanting a walk, but something lower, something that came from deeper in his chest, edged with urgency. Nora opened the door, let him into the yard, watched him circle the fence line twice, and called him back in. By Wednesday, he had stopped sleeping through the night. Amber noticed before anyone else did. She had always been that kind of child, the one who heard what wasn't being said out loud, who noticed the way a person's hands tightened before their voice did. She sat beside Darwin on the kitchen floor on Wednesday evening and watched his eyes track something none of them could see. His gaze pulled consistently in one direction, north. Toward the far end of town, where the old county facility sat behind its sagging chain-link boundary, past the grain supply store and the water tower and a stretch of road that most residents took without thinking. "He wants to show us something," Amber told her mother. Nora smiled the way adults smile when they are not really listening. "He wants his dinner, baby." But Darwin didn't touch his dinner. On Thursday morning, Amber clipped his leash herself. She had done it hundreds of times, a small, practiced motion, the clip snapping clean against his collar ring. She told her mother she was taking him around the block. That was not entirely a lie. She did go around the block. She simply kept going after the block ended. Darwin moved differently the moment the gate closed behind them. His nose dropped to the ground, his shoulders rolled forward, and the slack left the leash entirely. He was not wandering, he was navigating. There is a difference that even a 7-year-old can feel through 6 feet of nylon cord, the difference between a dog exploring and a dog with a destination. He led her past the grain store, past the water tower, down the gravel shoulder of the road she was not supposed to walk alone. Amber followed without question because she had learned in 2 years with Darwin that his instincts had never once been wrong. When he had sat beside her grandmother's chair for an entire evening last winter, quiet and watchful, her grandmother had been taken to the hospital the following morning. When he had refused to enter her classroom the day of the fire drill that turned out not to be a drill, the teachers had remarked later that the dog had known first. He always knew first. The county facility came into view through the tree line, its main building sun-bleached and official-looking, an American flag hanging limp in the still morning air. Amber had passed it in the car dozens of times. She had never had reason to look closely at it. Darwin didn't slow at the main gate. He pulled her along the fence line, away from the entrance, moving toward the rear of the property where the chain link turned older and the ground grew uneven, and a cluster of overgrown shrubs pressed up against the boundary like they were trying to hide what was behind them. A hand-painted sign was wired to the fence at eye level for an adult. Amber had to tilt her head back to read it. "No trespassing, authorized personnel only." Darwin sat down directly in front of it, looked back at her, then looked through the fence. Amber crouched beside him and peered through the gaps in the chain link. On the other side, half screened by the shrubs and the shadow of a corrugated utility building, she could make out the shapes of cages, metal, low, arranged in a rough line. And from somewhere inside them, barely audible, almost swallowed by the sound of the wind, came a sound that pressed directly into the center of her chest. Not a bark, not a growl. A slow, soft whine, the sound of something large and tired and alone. Darwin pressed his nose against the fence and held it there. Amber stood up slowly. She looked at the sign again. She looked back the way they had come. Then she found the gap in the fence that the overgrown shrubs had been quietly concealing for what looked like a very long time, just wide enough for a dog with a crooked ear and a small girl in a pink jacket, and she made a decision that no adult in her life would have made for her. She went through. There is something children understand about suffering that years of adulthood slowly teaches us to rationalize away. A child does not ask whether an animal in pain deserves help. They do not calculate the cost or the inconvenience or the risk to their own comfort. They simply move toward the hurt, because somewhere in the uncomplicated architecture of a child's heart, need and response are not separated by hesitation. Darwin didn't lead Amber to that fence by accident. He led her there because he understood, in whatever language dogs use to understand the world, that she was the only one who would actually come through. The ground on the other side of the fence was different, harder, more neglected. The grass that grew along the main yard had been cut and maintained with the kind of institutional regularity that suggested someone cared at least about appearances. Back here, no such effort had been made. Weeds pushed up through cracked earth. A rusted water drum sat on its side against the utility building wall, a thin brown stain marking where it had leaked for a very long time without anyone fixing it. The air smelled of metal and something older, the particular staleness of a place that had stopped being tended but had not yet been cleared away. Darwin walked beside Amber without pulling now. His job, it seemed, was finished. He had delivered her. What happened next was hers. She heard Runner before she saw him. Not the whine she had caught through the fence that had been distance softened, barely a signal. This was fuller, a low, rhythmic sound that rose and fell with each breath, the way grief sounds when it has been practiced so long it becomes involuntary. She rounded the corner of the utility building and stopped. There were 4 cages in the row. 3 of the dogs inside lifted their heads when she appeared, a reflex, the trained alertness that never fully leaves a working animal even when everything else has been stripped away. But the dog at the far end of the row did not lift his head, not at first. He was enormous, even collapsed inward on himself, the way he was, shoulders drawn, head heavy, spine curved with the posture of long surrender. The sheer scale of him was impossible to miss. 120 pounds of German shepherd, black and tan gone silver at the muzzle and brow, with paws so broad they nearly bridged the gap between the cage floor and the lower bar. His police tag still hung from his collar, dull now, the metal scratched and weather-worn, but still there. Still fixed to him, like a name he could never take off. The nameplate on his cage read Runner in stenciled black letters. He didn't look like something that had ever run. He looked like something that had finally, completely stopped. Then he raised his head. His eyes found Amber's, and the breath left her body in a way she wouldn't be able to describe to anyone for a long time afterward. They were deep brown, those eyes, rich in the way that old things are rich, layered with something that had no clean word attached to it. Not fear, not aggression, something far more difficult to witness than either. It was the look of a creature who had waited faithfully for a very long time and had only recently, quietly, accepted that no one was going to come. And then, as Amber stood absolutely still 3 feet from his cage, a tear formed at the inner corner of his left eye. It gathered slowly, caught the thin morning light, and ran a pale track down through the grey fur of his muzzle. She had heard adults say that dogs didn't cry, that the tears were biological, blocked ducts, allergies, irritation. She didn't know anything about biology yet. She only knew what she saw, which was a very large, very alone animal grieving openly, without shame, in a cage behind a building the town had decided not to look at anymore. Amber took 1 step forward. Runner flinched, barely, just a tightening across the shoulders, and she stopped immediately, the way she'd learned to stop around things that had been hurt before and hadn't yet decided whether you were safe. She crouched down to his level, made herself smaller, waited. Darwin sat behind her without a sound. Slowly, so slowly that the motion was almost imperceptible, Runner shifted his weight forward. His nose extended toward the bars. The chain at his collar clinked once and went still. Amber raised her hand, palm open, fingers together, and pressed it gently through the gap in the rusted iron. The cold of the metal bar ran along the back of her hand. Runner's nose touched her palm. He exhaled long and deep and shaking, the way a person exhales when they have been holding something for far too long and have finally, in the presence of something safe, allowed themselves to let it go. His eyes closed halfway. Another tear moved through the fur below his eye. Behind him, against the far wall of the cage, his tail moved once. Slowly, but it moved. Amber didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stayed exactly as she was, small hand through rusted bars, palm pressed to the nose of a broken giant, until the sound of heavy boots on gravel broke the silence behind her. She didn't pull her hand back. Runner had spent years being trained to trust commands, to follow orders, to serve without question. The one thing no one had trained him for was abandonment. Service animals are not decommissioned, they are discarded. And the cost of that discarding is not paid in paperwork. It is paid in the quiet, daily suffering of animals who were taught that loyalty was everything, and then shown, by the humans they trusted most, that it was worth nothing at all. If that sits wrong with you, it should. The system wanted to throw Runner away the moment he stopped being useful. If you believe loyalty should never have an expiration date, hit like. Not for the algorithm, for Runner, for every dog still waiting in a cage that no one official wants to talk about. The boots stopped 2 feet behind her. Amber heard the deliberate pause in them, the kind of pause that isn't uncertainty, but performance. The kind designed to make whoever is in front of it feel the weight of authority before a single word is spoken. She had been around enough adults to know the difference between someone who had arrived to help and someone who had arrived to be obeyed. The silence behind her had the texture of the second kind. She kept her hand against Runner's nose. "You need to step away from that cage." The voice belonged to Deputy Sheriff Walt Greer, though Amber didn't know his name yet. She only knew the shadow he cast, which was long, and the tone he used, which was the particular flatness of a man who had spent many years saying things he didn't expect to be questioned. He was broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his 50s, with a jaw that sat permanently set and eyes the color of old concrete. His uniform was pressed. His badge caught the light with the self-important gleam of something that had been polished very recently. He looked at the small girl crouched in front of Runner's cage the way a person looks at a problem that has appeared in a place problems are not supposed to appear. Amber stood up slowly. She did not step back. Greer's eyes moved from her to Darwin, then to Runner, then back to her with the calibrated patience of someone deciding which approach would resolve this fastest. He settled on the voice adults use when they want children to feel small without technically threatening them. Even, authoritative, laced with the implication that she had already done something wrong simply by being present. "This area is restricted," he said. "You and your dog are trespassing on county property. Do you understand what that means?" Amber understood what it meant. She also understood that he was waiting for her to look frightened, and she was working very hard not to give him that. "Why is he crying?" she asked. The question landed in the space between them without apology. Greer blinked, just once, a fractional reset, and then the flatness returned to his expression like a door being firmly reclosed. "That dog," he said, "is a decommissioned K9 unit. He is not your concern." "He's crying," Amber said again, not argumentatively, just with the particular precision of a child who has stated a fact and is waiting for someone to address it. Greer took a step forward, not aggressive, but measured, calibrated to close the physical distance in a way that reminded her of the size difference without requiring him to mention it. "That animal is dangerous," he said. "He has behavioral issues, he bites. He is not suitable for contact, and he is certainly not suitable for a child." He paused, letting each sentence settle like weight being stacked. "Where are your parents?" "At home." "Then you need to go back there, right now." Runner had not moved during this exchange. He stood pressed against the front bars of his cage with Amber's warmth still on his nose, watching Greer with a stillness that was not the stillness of a dangerous dog. It was the stillness of an animal that had been spoken about in cold, administrative language for long enough that it no longer expected the words to mean anything good. His ears were back. Not flat with aggression, low with a resignation that was somehow worse to witness than any growl could have been. Amber looked at Runner, then she looked at Greer. "He doesn't look dangerous," she said quietly. "He looks sad." Something moved across Greer's face, brief and quickly managed. It might have been discomfort. It might have been something sharper than that, the particular irritation of a man whose framing has been dismantled by a 7-year-old using nothing more than plain observation. He recovered within a breath, and when he spoke again, the flatness in his voice had compressed into something harder. He is a retired working animal. He is not a pet. He is not a companion. He is county property being processed according to county procedure, and none of that is any business of yours. He gestured toward the gap in the fence, the one she'd come through, now obvious to both of them. You're going to go back through that fence, you're going to take your dog, and you're going to go home. If I see you back here, I will call your parents myself. Do you understand me? Amber looked at the gap in the fence, then back at Runner. Runner's eyes had not left her face. She clipped Darwin's leash, slowly, deliberately, and took one step toward the fence. Then she stopped and turned back around, not with defiance, but with the calm certainty of someone who has just made a decision they intend to keep. "I'm coming back," she said. It was not a threat, it was simply a fact, delivered with the same directness she'd used for everything else. Greer stared at her. She held his gaze for one full second, then turned and walked to the fence, pushed Darwin through ahead of her, and disappeared through the gap into the shrubs. Greer stood in the silence she left behind. After a moment, he turned back toward the cages. Runner was still watching the place where Amber had been, nose against the bars, tail completely still, waiting again. Greer didn't look at him for long. Authority is not the same thing as rightness. Children know this instinctively. They haven't yet learned to mistake confidence for truth or a uniform for integrity. When Deputy Greer called Runner dangerous and broken, he was not describing the dog. He was describing what it cost him to see the dog clearly. The most revealing thing about that encounter wasn't what he said. It was what he refused to answer. She asked why Runner was crying. He told her Runner was county property. Those are not the same conversation, and the fact that he changed the subject is the only answer that matters. Amber didn't go straight home. She sat on the low concrete wall outside the grain supply store 3 blocks from the facility, Darwin pressed warm against her left side, and she stayed there long enough that the morning shifted from cool to sharp. She was thinking about Runner's eyes, about the way they had followed her to the fence, about the way they had stayed on the gap in the chain link long after she had gone through it, as though the watching itself was the only thing left he knew how to do. She was 7 years old, and she did not have the vocabulary for what she had seen, but she felt the shape of it with a precision that no vocabulary could have improved. Runner had not always been like that. She understood this the way she understood most true things, not through being told, but through the evidence in front of her, the width of his chest, the way he carried his head even in defeat, the bone structure of it still regal beneath the grief, the faded tag, the name stenciled on the cage in letters that had once meant something to someone. Dogs like Runner were not born in cages. They were built for something, trained, shaped, driven toward a purpose with the same deliberate intensity that goes into forging anything meant to be strong. What she could not have known, what most adults in that town could not have told her either, was the full scale of what Runner had lost. Not just his handler, not just his routine, his entire architecture of meaning. Working dogs do not experience retirement the way humans do. There is no gradual unwinding, no transition into leisure, no relief at the loosening of responsibility. For a dog trained from early life to work in precise partnership with a human being, the work is not separate from the self. It is the self. The commands, the tasks, the daily rhythm of purpose alongside a trusted person. These are not things a service animal does. They are things a service animal is. And when that structure is removed without replacement, without transition, without the presence of the person who represented safety and belonging and direction, what remains is not rest. What remains is Runner. Research into the behavioral health of retired K9 units tells a story that law enforcement agencies have been slow to publicize. Depression in retired working dogs is not a metaphor. It is a documented, observable condition, marked by appetite loss, withdrawal, disrupted sleep, and a particular form of vigilance that never fully switches off even when there is nothing left to be vigilant about. These animals spend years being neurologically conditioned to operate at high alert, to read threat and respond, to trust one person above all others. When the partnership ends, abruptly, without ceremony, without the dog's comprehension that conditioning doesn't dissolve, it turns inward. It becomes the whine Amber heard through the fence. It becomes the tears that the crowd at any official briefing would call biological and move past without further comment. Runner had been a decorated K9. His record, had anyone thought to pull it, would have shown years of active service, narcotics detection, suspect apprehension, search and rescue operations that put him in conditions most humans would not enter voluntarily. He had been placed in genuine danger on behalf of the department. He had been trusted with the lives of the officers he worked alongside, and he had honored that trust without reservation, without contract, without the ability to negotiate or refuse or ask what would happen to him when it was over. He had simply served, completely, for as long as he was asked. And then the asking stopped, and no one told him why, and he was moved to a cage behind a building the town had decided not to look at, and the food that came was inconsistent, and the medical attention was sparse, and the one sound that he had spent years learning to love, the particular footstep of his handler approaching, never came again. What Deputy Greer called behavioral issues had a more honest name. It was grief. Unmediated, unacknowledged, institutionally inconvenient grief in an animal that had been taught to give everything and had never once been prepared for the possibility that everything would not be enough to make him worth keeping. This is not a story unique to Runner. Across the country, in jurisdictions large and small, retired K9 units cycle through a system that has not kept pace with what the science of animal psychology has spent decades establishing. Some are adopted by their handlers, the fortunate ones, the ones whose partnership extended past the paperwork, but many are not. Many end up in exactly the situation Runner found himself in, warehoused, underfunded, administratively classified as surplus equipment, their suffering legal and quiet and entirely preventable. A society, it has been said, reveals its true character not in how it treats the powerful, but in how it treats those who can no longer offer anything in return. Runner had given the county years of service, and the county had given him a rusted cage and a stenciled name that nobody came to read. The cruelty in that is not dramatic, it is bureaucratic. And bureaucratic cruelty is the most durable kind, because it requires no villain to maintain itself, only indifference, spread thin enough across enough people that no single person feels responsible. Amber felt responsible. She didn't know the research. She hadn't read the studies. She had no framework for what service animal psychology was, or why it mattered, or what ethical obligation a department incurred the moment it put a living creature in uniform. She had none of that. What she had was the memory of Runner's eyes meeting hers through the bars, the exhale, the single, slow movement of his tail. She picked up Darwin's leash and stood up from the wall. She had told Greer she was coming back. She had meant it. When we train animals to serve us, we enter into something that functions in every meaningful way like a promise, even if we never say the words out loud. The animal cannot negotiate the terms. It cannot walk away. It gives what it is shaped to give, and in doing so it trusts us completely. To honor that trust costs very little. To break it, quietly, bureaucratically, behind a building at the back of a facility, costs the animal everything. Runner didn't need a monument. He needed someone to come back, and the only one who did was a 7-year-old girl who hadn't yet learned that the world expects you to look the other way. Amber came back the next morning. She had spent the evening doing what 7-year-olds do when they have made a decision that adults haven't approved yet. She said nothing, ate her dinner, answered her mother's questions about her day with the careful economy of someone who is not lying but is also not volunteering, and went to bed thinking about Runner's tale. The single, slow movement of it, the way it had happened almost without his permission, the way the body sometimes tells the truth before the mind has agreed to. She was up before Nora. Darwin was already at the back door. They moved through the early morning with the particular quiet of a partnership that had stopped needing instruction. The streets were thin with light, the air still carrying the cool of the night before, and Darwin's pace had changed again, not the frantic urgency of 2 days ago, but something more deliberate, more directed. He wasn't pulling her toward the facility this time. He was leading her, which is a different thing. The leash stayed slack between them the entire walk, as though he trusted her to follow without being asked twice. They came through the fence gap just as the sun cleared the tree line. The cages were quieter in the early morning. 2 of the dogs were sleeping. The third raised his head as Amber passed, watched her with the mild recognition of an animal that has been observed enough times to know the difference between a threat and a visitor, and settled his chin back on his paws. Runner was awake. He was always awake. She was beginning to understand the insomnia of a creature whose nervous system had been tuned too high for too many years to simply switch off in the dark. He saw her, and his ears came forward. She pressed her palm to the bars in greeting, their language now small and sufficient, and then Darwin pulled her attention sideways. He had moved away from the cage row. That was new. He stood 6 feet to her left, nose dropped to the ground, tracking something along the base of the utility building with the focused intensity he used when the world had given him a question he intended to answer. Amber watched him move along the wall, past the rusted drum, past a stack of weathered pallets, toward the far end of the building where the corrugated siding turned the corner, and a narrow path ran between the building's rear wall and the facility's inner fence. She followed him into the shadow of the path. It was tight, barely wide enough for an adult to walk without turning sideways, and the ground back here had never seen maintenance. Broken glass caught the light in one corner. A length of wire lay coiled against the wall like something discarded in a hurry. Darwin moved through it all without hesitation, nose down, until the path opened into a small clearing at the building's rear corner, and Amber stopped. There was a shed. It sat flush against the back of the utility building, constructed from the same corrugated material as if it had been designed to be missed. An extension that the eye would skip over on a casual inspection, its door secured with a padlock that was newer and heavier than anything else on the property, the kind of padlock that stands out precisely because of how out of place it is on a structure that was otherwise left to deteriorate without apology. Darwin sat in front of the door and looked at her. Amber tried the padlock, solid. She studied the shed's construction, the corrugated panels, the gap between the roof overhang and the top of the wall where the join was imprecise and air moved freely. She put her eye to the gap between the door frame and the panel beside it, where the wood had warped and pulled away from its fixings by perhaps a centimeter. It was enough. She could see shelving, boxes, and on the shelf closest to the door, catching the thin slant of light that came through the same warped gap, a stack of documents beside a ledger book whose cover was stamped with the county seal. Beneath the ledger, a plastic crate, and inside it, sealed bags of the kind of premium K9 nutrition supplement she had seen advertised on the back of the veterinary magazine in her mother's waiting room 6 months ago, enough of it to have been feeding the dogs well. All of it untouched. Beside the bags, 4 small boxes marked with a veterinary supplier's name and a handwritten date from 11 months prior. Medication, unopened. She pulled back from the gap and stood upright. The food and medicine that should have been going to Runner and the others, the supplies that county funds had paid for, that the department had signed off on, that someone had ordered and someone had received, was sitting locked in a shed behind a building nobody was supposed to find, while the dogs in the cages 10 feet away had been eating the minimum and receiving nothing for their pain. She was still standing there when she heard the gate at the front of the path open. Heavy footsteps, more than one person. She recognized the first set, Greer's, deliberate and weighted with the same performance of authority she had already learned to read from behind. The second set were lighter, quicker, and belonged to a man she had not yet met, the county sheriff himself, drawn to the facility that morning by an anonymous call that had come into the department's tip line the previous evening. Amber had used the payphone outside the grain supply store. She had not known it was anonymous. She had simply picked up the receiver and told the person who answered that there was a suspicious place at the back of the sheriff's facility and that someone should come and look at it properly. She had given the address. She had hung up. She had gone home and eaten dinner and said nothing. and she had come back this morning because she understood, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has not yet learned to wait for adults to handle things, that the call alone would not be enough. Someone needed to be here when they looked. She stepped out of the shadow of the path into the clearing, Darwin beside her, and faced the two uniformed men who had just turned the corner. Greer's jaw set the moment he saw her. The sheriff, a broad man in his 60s with a weathered face and eyes that were doing the opposite of Greer's, which was to say they were actually reading the scene in front of them, looked at Amber, then at the shed, then at the padlock, then back at Amber. "You the one who called?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said. "The dogs aren't getting their food." She pointed at the shed door. "It's in there." Corruption doesn't always announce itself loudly. It doesn't always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it wears a badge and a pressed uniform and operates in the administrative blind spots between what is documented and what is checked. The funds had been allocated. The supplies had been ordered. On paper, Runner and the others were being cared for. Paper, unlike a dog, cannot cry. It cannot press its nose through bars. It cannot make a 7-year-old girl's hands go cold with the knowledge that something is deeply, deliberately wrong. The most effective oversight in that facility wasn't an audit. It was a child who paid attention. Sheriff Dale Briggs was not a man who moved quickly to conclusions. 31 years in law enforcement had taught him the discipline of observation before reaction, the patience to let a scene reveal itself rather than forcing it into a shape that confirmed what he already suspected. He had arrived at the facility that morning expecting to dismiss a child's tip as misunderstanding, a misread label, a locked storage room containing nothing more alarming than outdated equipment. He stood in front of the shed for 40 seconds after Amber pointed at it. Then he turned to Greer and held out his hand. "Kay," he said. The silence that followed was its own kind of testimony. Greer's hand moved toward his belt, stopped. And the calculation that crossed his face in that half-second was visible enough that even Amber registered it, the rapid interior arithmetic of a man deciding whether the story he had prepared was still serviceable. It was not a long calculation. Briggs was still holding out his hand, and the hand was not moving, and the expression behind it had settled into something that made further delay its own form of confession. Greer produced the key. The padlock opened with the clean snap of something well-maintained, the one well-maintained thing on the entire property, and Briggs pulled the shed door wide and stood in the frame without speaking. The morning light fell across the shelving in full, the stacked supplements, the unopened medication boxes with their 11-month-old dates, the ledger with the county seal, which Briggs lifted with one hand and opened to the most recent page and read, without expression for a long time. Amber watched his face. She had learned from Darwin that the most important information in any situation was rarely the loudest thing happening. It was the thing underneath, the small shift, the breath that changed. Briggs closed the ledger. He set it back on the shelf with the careful deliberateness of a man deciding what the next hour of his life was going to look like. Then he turned around and looked at Greer with an expression that had nothing theatrical in it whatsoever, which made it more severe than anger would have been. He said 3 words, "Step over here." What passed between them after that was conducted in voices too low for Amber to follow, but the shape of it was clear enough, Greer's posture moving through defensiveness into the rigid stillness of a man who has run out of positions to retreat to. Briggs did not raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The ledger said everything that needed saying, and they both knew it. Amber had moved back to Runner's cage during this. She sat cross-legged on the ground in front of it, her pink jacket bright against the grey concrete, with her palm resting against the bars and Runner's nose pressed into it the way it had been the first morning. Darwin lay beside her, chin on his paws, monitoring the 2 uniformed men with the watchful patience of an animal that had learned to take its cues from the girl beside him. It was in this position that Deputy Greer, breaking away from Briggs with the cornered energy of a man who needed to assert something over someone smaller, made the mistake of walking toward her. "You need to move away from that cage," he said. The flatness in his voice had developed an edge now, the particular sharpness of authority that has been embarrassed and is looking for somewhere to land. Amber didn't move. I said step back from the animal. He has a name, she said. Greer stopped 2 feet from her. This does not concern you. This has never concerned you. You are a child on restricted property, and I am telling you for the last time. You used him. Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was the thing about Amber that would be hardest to explain later. To anyone who wasn't there, the words were never large, but they landed with the weight of something that had been thought through completely and could not be taken back. She looked up at Greer from where she sat on the ground, which should have made her seem smaller and somehow didn't. You used him to keep us safe, and now you're scared to feed him. The clearing went completely still. Greer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Behind him, Briggs had stopped moving. Amber continued, with the measured pace of someone reading from something written inside her chest. He went where you told him to go. He did what you trained him to do. He trusted you. She looked at Runner, then back at Greer. And you put him in a cage and locked his food in a shed. A pause. He's not a tool. He's not old equipment. He's Runner, and he's been crying, and you knew. The last 2 words were not an accusation. They were a verdict, stated plainly by someone who had not yet learned that the world prefers its verdicts dressed in more complicated language. Greer's jaw worked. His hand moved to his belt, found nothing useful there, and stopped. He was a man constructed entirely from the assumption that his authority would hold, and it was not holding, and the thing dismantling it was a 7-year-old girl sitting on cracked concrete in a pink jacket who had not raised her voice once. He looked to Briggs for the intervention that would restore the natural order. Briggs looked back at him with an expression that offered nothing of the kind. What neither of them knew yet was that a maintenance worker named Gerald, arriving early for his shift, had stopped at the entrance to the path when he heard voices and had remained there with his phone raised horizontally for the entirety of the last 4 minutes. Gerald was not a man given to drama. But he had worked at the facility for 9 years and had understood for most of those 9 years that something in the back section was not right, and the small girl sitting on the ground speaking plainly about loyalty and cruelty, while a deputy sheriff stood in front of her with nothing to say, had moved him in a way he wouldn't be fully able to articulate until much later. He uploaded the video before he went in for his shift. By noon, it had been viewed 40,000 times. By the end of the day, the number had added 2 more zeros. The caption Gerald wrote was 4 words. He'd lifted them directly from the clearing. He's not a tool. There is a particular kind of bravery that doesn't know it's brave, the kind that moves without calculating the cost, because the alternative, which is silence, has already been rejected on moral grounds too basic to require deliberation. Amber didn't stand between Runner and Greer because she was fearless. She stood there because she had looked into Runner's eyes and made him a promise, and she was the kind of person, even at 7, who understood that promises made to the vulnerable are the ones that matter most. The internet recognized something in that. 40,000 people, then 4 million, seeing in a child what they had spent years trying to remember in themselves. The people in that facility hoped no one would care about an old dog in a back cage. Comment, everyone deserves respect. If you would have stood where Amber stood, don't let apathy be the loudest voice in the room. Briggs walked through the facility alone. He did not radio ahead. He did not summon an escort or request that Greer accompany him or follow any of the procedural choreography that the situation might technically have called for. He simply walked through the main building, past the front desk, where the legal pad still sat with his notes, through the side corridor, out the back door into the yard, along the utility path that he had only walked once before that day and had not stopped thinking about since. His boots on the gravel were unhurried. The sound of the crowd at the gate had not changed. The contracted truck was still parked. The media vehicle that had been 1 block south was almost certainly at the gate now, because that was how these things moved, and Briggs had been in law enforcement long enough to understand that the window for doing the right thing quietly had already passed. What remained was simply the right thing. He came around the corner of the utility building and saw Amber exactly where Gerald had told him she would be, cross-legged on the ground, pink jacket, one hand through the bars, Darwin asleep beside her with his head on her knee. She looked up when she heard his boots. She did not look afraid. She looked, if anything, like she had been expecting him, which unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately name and would think about for a long time afterward. Runner was standing. That was the first change Briggs registered. Runner was on his feet, pressed close to the front of the cage, his great head lowered to Amber's level, his posture carrying something it had not carried that morning. Not the collapsed resignation of an animal that has given up. Something more tentative than hope, but pointed in the same direction. His eyes moved to Briggs when the sheriff entered the clearing, and the shift in them was immediate, the ancient wariness of an animal that had learned to read uniforms as the precursor to something unwelcome. His ears went back, his weight settled. Amber put her free hand on the bar beside Runner's nose, a small, stabilizing gesture. He felt it, and his breathing evened. Briggs stopped 4 feet from the cage and looked at the dog for a long time. He looked at the names stenciled on the cage door. He looked at the faded tag on Runner's collar. Then he looked at Amber, who was looking back at him with the particular patience of someone who has already done everything within their power and is now waiting to find out what the adult in front of them is made of. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a key ring. It was not a dramatic motion. He didn't announce it. He simply found the correct key, the third one, which he had taken from Greer's belt ring, while Greer was on his phone managing what he believed to be his primary problem, which had turned out to be a significant misunderstanding of what the primary problem was. And he stepped forward and put it in the lock on Runner's cage. The mechanism turned. The door swung outward with the slow, weighty movement of something that had been closed for a very long time. Briggs stepped back. Runner did not move immediately. He stood at the threshold of the open door and did what any animal does when the walls that have defined their world are suddenly removed. He processed it. His nose worked the new air. His eyes moved across the clearing with the systematic thoroughness of a trained dog reading an environment, checking for threat, reading the positions of the humans, returning always to the small figure still seated on the ground directly in front of him. Amber had not stood up. She stayed exactly where she was, cross-legged, her hands resting open on her knees, not reaching, not calling, not doing anything that could be read as demand or command. Just present, just available, the way she had been every morning since Darwin had led her through the fence, consistent and warm and entirely without agenda. Runner stepped out of the cage. One step, then another, each one placed with the careful deliberateness of an animal relearning what it means to move without walls on either side. He crossed the 3 feet of open ground between the cage door and Amber in the time it takes to exhale, and then his legs simply stopped holding. He went down at her feet like a building that has decided, finally, that it no longer needs to stand. Not a collapse of injury, not fear. The kind of going down that happens when something that has been braced against the world for an unbearable length of time finally, in the presence of something it recognizes as safe, releases the tension it has been carrying in every muscle and bone and breath. His great head came to rest across Amber's knee beside Darwin's, and the sound he made was not a whine and not quite a sigh, but something that lived in the space between the two. The sound of a creature setting down a weight it had stopped remembering it was carrying. Amber put both hands on the side of his face, very gently. Runner's eyes closed. Briggs stood in the clearing and watched this, and the thing that moved through his chest was not a feeling he had professional language for, so he did not try to name it. He was 62 years old. He had seen most of what the job produced, the worst of it, and occasionally the best of it, and the long, unremarkable middle of it that filled most days. He had not seen this before. 120 pounds of decorated service animal, a dog that had faced things in the line of duty that would have broken most creatures, lying with his head in a child's lap in the morning light, as though the entirety of his remaining life had been distilled into the simple fact of her hands on his face. Behind Briggs, footsteps entered the clearing. Greer stopped when he saw the open cage. His eyes moved from the door to Runner to Amber to Briggs, and whatever argument he had been assembling on his walk over did not survive contact with what he found. He stood very still. Briggs turned to face him. He didn't reach for the legal pad or the ledger or any of the documentation that would matter in the days that followed: the formal suspension, the county investigation, the audit that would eventually account for every misallocated dollar in that shed. All of that was coming, and both of them knew it. But it was not this moment. This moment had already resolved itself into something that paperwork would record but could not contain. "We are done here, Walt," Briggs said, quietly, finally. Greer looked once more at Runner, at the dog he had called dangerous, broken, county property, a liability to be processed, lying with his eyes closed and his breathing slow across the knees of a 7-year-old girl who had simply refused to leave. He turned and walked back up the path without a word. Darwin lifted his head as he left, watched him go, then set it back down against Runner's shoulder with the satisfied authority of a dog whose work is genuinely, completely finished. The transformation in that clearing was not Runner's alone. Something shifted in Briggs that morning that no performance review would ever capture. The recognition, late but real, that the systems we build to protect communities can develop quiet rot in their foundations, and that the rot is only ever found by the people paying attention to what the system has decided isn't worth watching. Runner had trusted humans entirely and been failed entirely. And then he trusted once more, not because he had been given reason to, but because a child had been patient enough and present enough and consistent enough to earn it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The paperwork took 4 days. Briggs handled most of it personally, which was not standard procedure, but which he had decided was necessary, partly because the situation required a level of care that he did not trust to delegation, and partly because sitting with the paperwork gave him something to do with the responsibility he felt for the years it had taken anyone to look closely at the back section of his own facility. The county investigation opened on the same day Greer was placed on administrative suspension. The audit of the K-9 Welfare Fund began the day after that. The contracted veterinary service that should have been visiting the facility quarterly and had not been, because the visits had been signed off on paper by someone who had found a more profitable use for the associated budget, was replaced within the week by a practice 20 minutes north of town whose lead vet, a woman named Dr. Adiz Obi. Drove out the same afternoon, she received Briggs's call and spent 3 hours examining every dog in the row with the focused attention of someone making up for lost time. Runner was malnourished. His joints showed the inflammation of an animal that had not received his prescribed anti-inflammatory medication for the better part of a year. He had an untreated infection in his left ear that had been developing, by Dr. Obi's estimate, for several months. All of it was manageable. All of it was the direct consequence of funds diverted and care withheld, and a system that had relied on nobody looking. Somebody had looked. Dr. Obi treated him in the clearing, which Amber had refused to leave until the examination was complete. She sat beside him throughout, through the ear cleaning that made him flinch and then lean into her hand, through the injection that he accepted with the stoic patience of an animal that has endured worse, through the long assessment during which Dr. Obi moved her hands across his frame with professional thoroughness and spoke quietly to him the entire time in a tone that was not clinical but genuinely kind. When it was over, Dr. Obi sat back on her heels and looked at Amber. "He's going to be fine," she said. "He needs time, good food, rest, consistency," she paused, "and someone who isn't going anywhere." Amber nodded as though this had already been decided, which, in every way that mattered, it had. The formal transfer of Runner's custody to the Delaney family, Nora's surname, and now Amber's, and now Runner's, was completed on a Thursday morning in Briggs's office, with Roy and Nora seated across the desk and Amber standing between them with her hand resting on Runner's back. He sat beside her at exactly her height, which meant his head was level with her shoulder, and he stayed there with the focused, quiet attentiveness of an animal that has rediscovered its purpose and does not intend to stray from it again. Briggs signed the transfer documents with the pen he kept in his breast pocket and slid them across the desk and said very little, because the moment did not require him to say much. What he did say, before they stood to leave, was directed not to Roy or Nora, but to Amber. "You did something here," he told her. "I want you to know that I understand what it cost you to keep coming back." He looked at her steadily. "Not everyone would have." Amber considered this with the seriousness she gave to things that deserved it. "Darwin knew where to go," she said. "I just followed him." Briggs looked at the dog beside her, 120 pounds of German Shepherd, silver at the muzzle, amber-eyed. Carrying the particular gravity of an animal that has been through the worst of what human negligence can produce and has come out the other side, not broken but deepened. Runner looked back at him with the calm, assessing steadiness of a working dog that has found its post and intends to hold it. "Take care of each other," Briggs said. They went home on a Thursday afternoon in the flat gold light of early autumn. The four of them, Roy driving, Nora in the passenger seat, Amber in the back between a Labrador mix with a crooked ear and a retired police K9 who had not left her side in 4 days and showed no intention of starting. Runner sat with his shoulder pressed against hers and his great head turned slightly toward the window, watching the town pass with the quiet interest of an animal seeing familiar geography from an unfamiliar angle. The facility went by on the right. He tracked it as they passed, ears forward, and then the car moved on and it was behind them, and he turned his face forward and rested the weight of his jaw against Amber's shoulder. She put her arm around him. He did not pull away. In the weeks that followed, the town adjusted to the presence of a 120-pound German Shepherd moving through it with calm authority, at the school gates in the afternoon, at the grain supply store on Saturday mornings, along the sidewalks of Callaway Street in the early light with Amber and Darwin on either side of him, the three of them moving together with the particular ease of a unit that has found its formation. Neighbors who had never noticed Amber before stopped to speak with her now. People left cards. A woman from 4 streets over, who had fostered dogs for 15 years and had been doing it quietly without recognition, started a formal petition to the county for an improved K9 retirement policy that eventually gathered enough signatures to reach the state level. Dolores, the retired schoolteacher, wrote a letter to the local paper that ran on the front page and was reprinted twice. She had taught composition for 31 years. She knew how to make a sentence land. The letter's closing line was the one people remembered. "We owed that dog a debt, and a child collected it on our behalf," which tells us everything we need to know about the kind of town we had been and the kind we must now choose to become. Runner never cried again. Not in the technical sense. Dr. Obi treated the underlying cause, and the physical tears ceased with the infection. But the other kind, the deeper kind that Amber had recognized through the fence on a morning when she was the only person paying attention, the grief tears of an animal abandoned past the point of hope, those stopped too, and they stopped on the afternoon in the clearing when a small girl kept her hands on the side of his face and held still long enough for him to believe her. He slept at the foot of Amber's bed every night. He positioned himself each morning at the front door and remained there until she left for school, at which point he relocated to the window that offered the best sightline to the end of the street where the school bus stopped. He ate well. He put weight on in the right places. The grey in his muzzle spread a little further with each passing month, as it does with all agging things, and it suited him. It gave him the look of something that had earned its years rather than merely accumulated them. He did not have the look of a dog waiting anymore. He had the look of a dog who had arrived. What Amber understood, without being taught it, is the thing that takes most of us a lifetime to learn, and many of us never fully do, that the measure of a person is not how they behave toward those with power over them, but how they behave toward those entirely at their mercy. Runner could not advocate for himself. He could not file a complaint or make a call or stand in a road. All he could do was wait and hope, and eventually, in the absence of any evidence that hope was warranted, keep waiting anyway, because loyalty of that depth doesn't know how to stop. He deserved better from the system. He got it from a child, and the distance between those two facts is the distance between the world as it is and the world as it could be, a a distance that gets smaller every time someone chooses, as Amber chose, to go through the fence. Many would have walked past that facility 100 times and never looked twice. Would you have gone through the fence? Subscribe and share this story, not for the numbers, but for Runner, and for every dog still waiting in a cage that no one official is looking at. The message of mercy only travels as far as the people willing to carry it.